Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, we're going to be talking about the gaming industry as I am joined by author and gaming and business attorney, Glenn Wichinsky. Glenn is the author of the book, Things Left Unsaid, and he knows both sides of the gaming industry, from the personal side to what it is today, modern Las Vegas. So we're going to be talking to him about this industry that has become so big and that a lot of people participate in today. So Glenn, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Curtis. Thank you for having me with you.
Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, I started out in upstate New York in the Catskill Mountains as a child. Made my way to New York and ultimately spent most of my childhood in the Miami area in South Florida. Lived a typical lifestyle, middle class home, homework, marching band with a saxophone, do your homework and so on. And my journey started with going to the University of Miami, where I was going to become a meteorologist. Worked in the National Hurricane Center as an intern, and that was my path. At least that was my chosen path until my father, who lived in Nevada, parents were divorced when I was young, convinced me that my path in life was to work with him in the gaming industry. So I went from studying hurricane development and watching cloud development into slot machines and casinos, which was quite a switch.
Yeah, well, I know your book is more than about just the gaming industry. You know, it's about family identity and discovering the truth. So, at what point did you know that you needed to share your father's story?
Well, about 5 years ago during the pandemic, when we all had a lot of time on our hands, I thought it would be a good idea to leave a family memoir for my two children. Tell them stories that maybe they didn't know about me, about my life, about our immediate and extended family, and just to have something for posterity to reflect upon someday. That was the intention. And what changed my direction from just a simple family memoir was that a book came out some years ago by the daughter of a Nevada Gaming Control Board investigator. The book was called Hit Me, and the author is a wonderful lady named Daniel Gomes. And Daniel wrote a book about her father, his investigations, his life. And usually when I look at books about Las Vegas, because I spent many years out there growing up and then in my adult life, I'd go to the index of a book to see if I recognized any names of people that I had met along the way. And I looked at the back of her book in the index and I saw my father's name referenced, but it wasn't like a 1 or 2 page reference. It actually was a full chapter about him. Uh, I went to the chapter, I started reading it. I immediately ran to the checkout counter and bought the book and ran to my car and I read that chapter from front to back, maybe 20, 25 pages. And I was just shocked and amazed because I read stories about my father that I never knew. He worked in the gaming industry at the Sands Hotel and Casino. He was a gaming manufacturer, a slot manufacturer for Bally Manufacturing in the 60s and 70s. But I only knew the surface of a story. But after reading what she wrote and then putting together and, connecting the dots in my life of things that just seemed a little bit odd, that I didn't truly understand, it became more of a book about not only about my life, but about my father's life, and one that he would never have and could never have written because he once told me that if he ever talked about or wrote about his life, he would need a bulletproof vest.
Well, I know you grew up in the early stages of the Nevada gaming industry. So, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about the early days of Nevada gaming and who created it? Because people only, only know about it through movies.
Right, right. Well, in terms of history, a lot of people think that organized crime brought gambling to Nevada. They developed gambling and the casinos on the Strip and the high class atmosphere of the hotels and casinos in the 50s and 60s. But legalized gambling, was enacted in Nevada actually in 1931. It was at the height of the Great Depression, and the state legislature and government decided that this would be a means of drawing in revenues that they sorely needed to support their budget and to support the state needs. So gambling was already legalized at an early time. The organized crime families came in the late 40s. Notable people like Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky and many of the family interests from the East Coast and Midwest mob families had their interests there, invested their monies. And so they developed Las Vegas into what it was known in the early days. And they were very successful at what they did. Um, Eventually, it transformed into a corporate America situation basically because the mob was under a microscope and people being wiretapped by the FBI uh, for organized crime inquiries that were truly they were conducted by the late Robert Kennedy when he was Attorney General. And between that and the fact that the mob couldn't get usual bank loans, commercial loans, and they couldn't use their own money, they felt like maybe it was time to exit, and that started happening in the late 1960s when Howard Hughes started purchasing many of the major hotel casinos on the Strip.
Well, speaking of the mob, I know your dad's life intersected with the mob in the casino world, but you chose a different path as a business and gaming attorney. So, how did you manage to create your own legacy different from your father's?
When I graduated from the University of Miami, a political science degree, ultimately, and when I moved to Las Vegas, I spent 3 years at my father's office. I was supposed to work with him, but I didn't have more than a desk and a paycheck, which was confusing to me because I thought I was going to learn about the business and be heir to the company someday. But it always puzzled me where I was there. I got to know him because he didn't know me. I didn't know him since we left each other when I was 4 years old. But ultimately, I made the decision to leave Las Vegas. But I gained a lot of knowledge about the industry. It was more like sitting in the audience of a movie theater watching a movie and just taking in everything that you're hearing and seeing. And the exit for me out of a family business was to become a professional, how to find an honorable way out. And law school was the opportunity that came to me. So I attended law school in Sacramento, California at the University of the Pacific. Went to 4 years of night school, worked in the day at the legislature as a legislative aide and for a judge as a judicial clerk. When I ultimately got my Juris Doctor degree, I said, okay, now I'm an attorney. What do I want to do with this? It wasn't my desire or my direction to become an attorney. And I didn't want to practice any traditional paths of law, whether it be criminal law, corporate law, um, personal injury, and others. And I thought that maybe if I could combine the knowledge that I had in the gaming industry and combine that with my law degree, um, I could become something hopefully good in my field, competent, and it was a new and growing field at the time when I became an attorney. So I fashioned myself as a gaming attorney, started representing clients in different areas of regulated and licensed gaming, and I've been doing that for 40 years now.
Well, I know writing your book required you to revisit complicated memories and family history. So, What was the biggest truth that you had to revisit when telling your story, or the hardest truth?
Well, there were some inconsistencies in my life, Curtis, when I was with my father. The first one that I recall was when I was first married in the 1970s. And at my wedding, my former sister and brother-in-law were in the parking lot taking a break from the reception. And they saw these two men in suits writing down license plate numbers. And they approached them, and my sister-in-law said, "What do you think you're doing?" And the big tall man said, "Mind your business, young lady." I learned about this years later, but I was figuring, well, why are people taking license plate numbers in the parking lot of where I'm getting married? And it turned out that was an individual that my father invited to the wedding who was of interest to the FBI. Years later, I traveled with my father, and he'd take me on a trip overseas, a business trip. And coming back to the United States, he'd say, "Listen, Glenn, if we get stopped at customs for any reason, go ahead to the hotel. This is where we're staying, and I'll catch up with you later." And I would say to him, I'd say, "Dad, why would you be stopped at customs?" And he'd say, "Well, there's another person with my name and my birth date who's a Canadian, and he's apparently on a government watch list." So these kind of stories were kind of inconsistent and curious to me, but I was also somewhat naive in those days. Um, but when the book came out by Daniel Gomes and I read about my father, I guess the big shocking revelation was I knew that he had to rub elbows with people in the industry and that was mob dominated in those years, but I didn't realize how deeply involved he was with them from a business perspective. Ms. Gomes wrote about informants testifying to investigators that my father spent a lot of time in Havana, Cuba in the late 50s, assisting the mob with their slot machines and their operations and representing interests of some people that couldn't be licensed themselves because of who they were. So I think the big revelation to me, Curtis, was realizing that my father was much deeper involved in activities than I ever truly knew or imagined, but understanding later on in life that the reason that I didn't know it and the reason that he wanted me around him but not involved in the business is because he didn't want me around the people that he was working with. And he did me a favor.
Well, I know you've watched Nevada gaming transform from a personality driven industry to a corporate powerhouse. So, talk about the biggest change that you've seen in the Nevada gaming industry over your career.
Let's take a quick break.
In Kansas, blind vending operators are vanishing without a trace. No bodies, no witnesses, only silence. Detective Michael Miguel thought he had seen everything, but this case pulls him into something far darker. A web of institutional corruption so deep it was never meant to be uncovered. When vulnerable blind people disappear and bureaucracies close ranks, one question remains: who will fight for justice? As Miguel digs deeper, he uncovers a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of power, a system that exploits the very people it was designed to protect. The truth is buried in paperwork, hidden behind closed doors, guarded by those who have everything to lose. Some conspiracies hide in plain sight. This one hides in the dark. Iron Cane Media presents The Blind Conspiracy, written by Mikhail Battles Sr., available now on Amazon.
In the beginning of, I'd say I started practicing law in Nevada in the early 1980s. Um, it was very informal doing business with people. Um, I recall my father could sit down with a casino manager introducing him to a new slot machine or gaming device that he had developed and wanted the casino manager to try the game out. And they'd have lunch, they talk about it. Casino manager would say, I'll try to find some space on my casino floor to see how the game does. They would shake hands after a meal, and that was done. Of course, today you'd have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. You'd have to prove that your games performed well in other casinos, that you're not the first one testing out the game. And everything has become very formal, business-like, money centers, um, and a truly corporate America. It's kind of sad, but that's just the way it's developed. And then when public companies were permitted to get licensed in the 1980s, Nevada had changed some laws which permitted public companies to own and operate gaming properties and casinos without the requirement of each and every shareholder having to be investigated. So you can imagine if you had a public company with 1,000 shareholders before these laws were changed, each and every one of them would have to be investigated, even though they were just a passive investor. And now the laws are more relaxed and licensing is limited to officers and directors and generally 5 or 10% equity holders in the company, whether it was private or public company. So it is totally different. I do miss the older days and the simpler days, but it's a lot more legitimate and regulated and tightly controlled today, which is a good thing.
Well, I know you've helped gaming companies navigate compliance, expansion, and technologies. So, talk about some of the biggest challenges gaming companies face today that people don't see.
I think there's a method behind becoming successful as a gaming company, gaming manufacturer, distributor. And I think the biggest lesson that I've learned that I've tried to teach my clients is, especially foreign clients that are trying to come into the US market, I try to impress upon them that, your games may do very well in your home country, but you can't assume that they're going to do the same and be as profitable in the US. You're dealing with different players, different markets, and so on. And I've had clients who have entered the US market from Europe or South America with a bit of an ego and a lot of money. And they would build their infrastructure and build their plants and employ 80 to 100 employees from day one without first testing their game on a casino floor through maybe a distributor to see if the players like their game. So I've seen that happen a couple times where people lost significant capital because they did it backwards. Um, and I believe of a conservative method that I've learned about first introducing your product, testing it out, seeing if people like them before you invest vast amounts of money is truly the way to go. And that's just more of a gaming marketing and method that I've learned over time, and many of my clients have learned that as well from me or just being in the industry.
We'll talk to the listeners about your book, kind of tell us what we can expect when we read it and where we can get it.
Um, the book was published in January of this year, and it starts out tracing my family history, both my father's side of the family in upstate New York, where my father was the youngest of 10 children, living on top upstairs from a family bakery that operated for 50 years, and how he and his family members survived from a poor family with a single parent, and how they engaged themselves in gray area businesses to survive. And at the same time, I would talk about my maternal side, my grandfather, my mother's father, who was a barber in the nearby town and had some cottages along a lake in Loch Sheldrake, New York, and how he would be dealing with the same individuals that my father was, but a generation earlier. And he was a barber giving haircuts and shaves to mobsters who were hanging out in the area, while in the evening there were people being found in the nearby lake after they were disposed of by the mob. So all of this gaming activity and mob activity really traced back in my family and in their surroundings back to the 1930s. But the book goes forward. It traces my life growing up in in the Bronx in New York City, near Yankee Stadium. The good times that I had as a young child there and being in the Little League, prep playing games across the street from the old Yankee Stadium, and then ultimately moving to Miami. Um, as I mentioned, my education and it went full blast through my childhood and my adult years and its challenges that I faced. Um, and then segued into my father's life and talked about how he made a name for himself. He was actually very well respected, but he chose a path to get there, which I can't really judge him on because I didn't live his life. I wasn't supporting a family on alimony at the time like he was. So it's a full circle in the book, and I think I've paid some homage and some honor on my father, telling his story where he couldn't.
Well, tell us about any upcoming projects that you're working on that listeners need to be aware of.
Well, I've been asked about what my next book is, but I haven't started writing it. But I appreciate hearing the comments from people who've read my book and they enjoyed my writing style. Um, and that's a compliment that you don't often get. There's been inquiries about maybe trying to do a screenplay or a miniseries on the book. That hasn't advanced much yet, but the writing style that I've used is more, I've been told, to be cinematic and more storytelling from a what could transpose to a movie situation. Um, Projects that I'm working on, actually, I'm working on one project now, which is developing an online casino for a Caribbean land-based casino that's been in operation for years. It's very methodical, um, from choosing the right jurisdiction to get licensed in, where to place your games, where to broadcast them to, where it's legal to do so, how to get licensed. Um, it's a major project, but it's a new one for me. I have never been that deeply involved in the online gaming side, but it's really the future of gaming in its positive and its negative ways. And besides that, I continue to teach as an adjunct professor at the University of the Pacific McGeorge School of Law, where I went to law school years ago. And I teach gaming law and regulation to students of my alma mater, so that's very pleasing to me as well.
Well, so listeners can keep up with everything that you're up to, throw out your contact info.
Uh, well, people can reach me through my website. It's globalgaminglawyer.com. And I certainly hope that those of your listeners have a chance to read the book and enjoy it and pass their comments on to me if they'd like. And I truly appreciate the time today that you've provided to me, Curtis.
Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen. You said globalgamingwarrior.com, right?
Correct.
All right. Well, you have any final thoughts for the listeners? Maybe if there was something I forgot to talk about that you would like to touch on?
Well, yes, I would. I'd like to touch on challenges and overcoming them. It's a universal theme. We've all had our ups and downs, maybe not the exact story, but I think we either survive by perseverance and belief in ourselves, or we don't. Um, in the course of my life, I've been fortunate to be successful in business, but then I've been unfortunate to start over again in my early 50s after an unexpected divorce. So I financially chose to make a settlement and start my life over. So at the age of 51, I was living in a motel in Laughlin, Nevada, operating a casino on the Colorado River and living in a $15 a night motel while still doing what I could to support my two children. And, I had a choice to make at that time, Curtis. I could either let myself down and maybe do something not so wise personally to myself, or have belief in myself that I could get back on my feet, work hard, believe in myself, and have faith that life is going to turn around. And ultimately, it did. I have a very close friend of mine who once paid me a compliment, but it really didn't seem like a compliment at the time because he knew my life. And he said, "You know, Glenn, you remind me of a clown." I said, "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" He says, "No, no, no, you don't understand what I'm saying." He says, "You remember when we were children and they used to have these blown up clowns that would sit upright, and if you would hit it, it would fall to the side and then it would immediately pop back up." He says, "That's what you remind me of." And it was a very kind compliment, but thinking about it, I think a lesson that I learned and others hopefully do as well is when you get knocked down and you feel the pain. Uh, you try to get yourself back up as soon as you can and keep going. So I guess that's what I'd pass on to your listeners.
Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen. And for more information on Glenn and his book and everything that he's up to, globalgamingwarrior.com is the website. Please go check out the book and follow, rate, review, share this episode, especially to those who love gaming. And also visit, if you haven't already done so, www.curveball337.com to keep up with all things living the dream. Thank you for listening and supporting the show. And Glenn, thank you for having the courage to share your story. Thank you for all that you do. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Curtis.
For more information on the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, visit www.curveball337.com. Until next time, keep living the dream.